Hi everyone, I'm Matthew Bateman. This is the New Old Catholic Family. So today is part 4 out of 5 of this Catholic exploration of the question, what is the gospel? If you have not already watched parts 1 through 3, please go back and do so first because we are jumping right into it today. So where we last left off, it would seem, not as a theological statement, but just from a mortal point of view, that God would find himself in a kind of a conundrum. On the one hand, if God is going to be perfectly good and perfectly just, and let's hope that he is, then God must punish injustice. It is not good to let evil, wickedness, sin go unpunished. And we might think of ourselves as very good, but no one can measure up to the standard of an almighty God, which is the perfection of his own nature. And we would all stand before him guilty. On the other hand, if God is going to be perfectly loving and perfectly merciful, and again, let's hope that he is, then God would want a way to reconcile us to himself, to commune with us once again, to share his divine love with us, to have us experience his divine life, to take us as his people, and for he to be our God. And so, again, from a lay perspective, there seems to be this kind of a conundrum between God's justice and his mercy. So what if I told you that 2,000 years ago, a pretty average-looking blue-collar guy emerges on the scene, born from some poor, backwater, podunk town in a somewhat fading corner of the Roman Empire, and he claims that he himself, not merely his teachings, not merely his example, but his own being, his own person is the solution, indeed the solution to this problem. And I bet you already know his name. That's right, put your history caps on. Today might be kind of a longer video, but important questions require and deserve important answers, and this might be the most important question and answer session of all. It's time to talk about the most well-known, most popular, most beloved, and most controversial Jewish rabbi in human history, Jesus of Nazareth. Bateman. This is the New Old Catholic Family. So it's 2022 and we're talking about Jesus. Hasn't everyone basically heard this already? Well, no. As I see it, there are 3 broad categories of people who still do not yet believe. The first would be those who haven't heard it. Maybe they just haven't heard it, or maybe they've heard it in name only. Like, yeah, there's this guy called Jesus and this book called the Bible, and they go to this place called churches, but they've never really heard the point. Or maybe they've heard the point quickly, somewhat dismissively on TV, radio, internet, some tract in their hotel room, but maybe they've never really paused and crunched the spiritual numbers and done the metaphysical math and weighed their soul in the balance of good and evil, sin, life, death, salvation, eternity, and all of that. And if this is you, then this video is for you. Welcome. I hope you enjoy it and I hope this video blesses you. The second broad category of people would be those who, out of pride or offense, just maybe dismiss it quickly. This again would be those that we've already touched on along the lines of, I'm a good person, salvation doesn't really apply to me, that's offensive, what has this got to do with me? Or, how could a good God send people to hell, that kind of thing. And I do intend in future videos to do more that grapples specifically with the interplay of God and suffering, the reality of a good God coexisting with the reality of evil. But for this series, I think I've already definitely covered enough about good and evil, the soul, sin, judgment, in my third video. So if you've already watched it, it might be worth your time, and I maybe encourage you to go back and chew on it a little bit more slowly and deeply and contemplate the message that is available to you there. But the third category of people, broadly speaking, who do not yet believe is where I'm going to be spending the majority of my time today, and those would be skeptics. It is not infrequently that I dialogue with people online from a wide variety of walks of life, And I don't know what's going on in their minds or hearts or souls and what internal barriers they might be putting up to belief. But from the external of what I can, see or know or understand about them, it does seem that just genuine doubts about the New Testament premise prevent them. And these vary from the least reasonable to the most reasonable, but I hear people say things like, can we believe a book that talks about miracles, period? Or weren't the Gospels written many, many decades later and probably not even by the apostles? How can we trust what they say? Or how can a man rise from the dead? Isn't it more logical and preferable that we would adopt some other answer to that question? Or is there any evidence for Jesus outside the Bible and evidence for his miracles outside the Bible? Why should I take this one book's testimony? Wouldn't it be somewhere else? Or doesn't the Bible have errors and doesn't the text have variations? How can we say then that it's a trustworthy, reliable document? How do we know that these fables weren't inserted into it after the fact? Or, Jesus claimed to be a kind of holy man, but he never claimed to be God. That was an invention of many hundreds of years later, probably by Constantine and all of those. So I'm going to spend a lot of time trying to be as thorough as I can be, addressing all these claims as best I can. I'm going to try and give you guys historical citations, and I'm going to start with the least reasonable, hopefully make our way up through the most reasonable, and then afterwards we'll start to examine then some of the spiritual claims and implications of the person of Jesus of Nazareth. So the first most unreasonable claim is Jesus is a myth. Now, there are a lot of people who would say Jesus is not the divine Son of God, that Jesus did not rise from the dead. But Jesus mythers, as they are sometimes called, would even go as far as to say that Jesus of Nazareth was not even a historical human being who lived and walked on the ground. According to this point of view, Jesus is in fact just the next iteration in a long line of solar dying and rising gods. And they would even say that if you look at a lot of the high points and themes of Jesus' life, that he performed miracles, that he was born of a virgin, that he had 12 disciples, that he was crucified, he called himself the Son of God, he died and rose again, these sorts of things, that you'll see these same high points and point-for-point motifs in these pre-Christian dying and rising gods. And so they say these claims, these themes and motifs are just recycled, regurgitated copycats of all this pre-Christian stuff that are in the myths of these other deities. So I'm going to address this to try and thoroughly debunk it. Let's start by saying that New Testament scholars and scholars of the history of antiquity, even if they are atheists or agnostics, Jewish, any expression of non-Christian, it is not up for academic debate that Jesus was a historical figure. They're all unanimous, and it is like sub-middle school level history to try and suggest that Jesus did not even exist. But I'm going to take some of the claims of these pre-Christian pagan deities and kind of show you point for point, as it was done in the Zeitgeist documentary or Bill Maher's documentary Religulous, and try and show you side by side how the so-called copycat themes in Christianity are not at all the same kinds of things that you see in these dying and rising gods, so-called. So, the three, you could do this with many pagan deities, but the three that are most popular, that I maybe hear the most cited most often, and the ones that I happen to know about in my field of religious studies, history, and philosophy, are going to be the Egyptian god Horus, the Greek god Dionysus, whom the Romans called Bacchus, and the Persian god, who many centuries later was appropriated for Roman worship, Mithras. So let's go through each of these. Let's start with Horus. So, was there a virgin birth? No. Horus's father is the god Osiris. Horus's mother is the goddess Isis. Osiris and Isis, god and goddess, have god sex, and Horus is the god baby that's born. So, it's not at all the Christian claim to a virgin birth, and the most you could get away with saying was that it was like a pure birth because there was no mortal sexuality involved. And that's a point worth pausing on for just a moment. Now, some of these claims that people say are copycatted and regurgitated by Christianity are baseless. They have no claim in historical evidence, in academic, scholarly, historical literature, or actual writings of these myths. And by a bad game of telephone, someone said that that was the case, and then through the years has been passed down, and now people just repeat that without any substantiation for whether or not it's true. Or, more than likely, as in the case of Horus's pure birth, you'll see that there's some detail in this deity's myth or story that's stretched so far and just wrenched wildly out of context, so much so that unless you were told beforehand to try very hard to read Christian themes into these myths, no reasonable person would read details like that on their own in the myth of Horus and then say, oh, that's just like Christianity. It just doesn't work like that, okay? And you'll see that wrenched theme that barely hints at it, but is not even remotely close to what Christians are claiming, that they claim actually happened in Jesus' story in the Gospels. So no virgin birth. What about a crucifixion? Well, no, there is no crucifixion for Horus. Not only because the myth, as I understand it, is not entirely unanimous as to whether or not Horus died at all, let alone to what type of death he suffered, but even granted that a myth talks of his death, there was no crucifixion. Do you want to know why? Because the Egyptians did not practice crucifixion. In fact, I don't even know that the Horus myth mentions impaling, but the closest thing that the Egyptians had to crucifixion was impaling, which is where they take one's entire body and just skewer the entire thing through on a long, sharp pole. But that's even granted that Horus was impaled. I want someone in the notes to show me if in the Horus myth he was actually impaled. And that's trying to do the Jesus myth a favor to grant, well, perhaps he was impaled. But even if that's the case, we wouldn't say, oh, well, being stabbed in battle with a spear is practically like being impaled, and being impaled is practically like being crucified. And so you can see how, again, even if the myth would say that he died by impaling, impaling is not crucifixion. And that's trying to give the Jesus myth camp a stronger argument by even helping them out with the notion of impaling. So show me in the comments below where Horus was impaled in the myth. Now, third, was Horus raised from the dead? Now, here's something I want to pause again on and parse out in a little more detail. So it may be that in Horus's myth, there is a kind of rebirth. Daytime, Horus is victorious. Nighttime, he's defeated. Daytime, he's victorious. Nighttime, he's defeated. Day and night, rising and falling, rising and falling. And again, even on the face of it, you can see this is not the Christian claim to the resurrection from the dead. That Jesus died once, that he rose once, that he suffers no more. Not only is he no longer subject to death, but in fact, death is in fact subject to him. And he holds the power to death and Hades in his hand. No, this kind of perpetual death and rebirth is something more akin to, if I can make the comparison, and this is what I'm leading up to something here, my audience might be more familiar with the Greek story of Persephone, a beautiful maiden. Hades, the Greek god of the underworld, kind of had a thing for her and caught her in a kind of forced marriage. But the gods saw a loophole of sorts in his plans, and so Persephone was allowed for half of the year to live and walk up here in the mortal world with us. That's where spring and summer come from. And for half the year, she was required to live down in the underworld with Hades and be his bride. And that's where winter and fall come from. Winter, spring, summer, fall. Winter, spring, summer, fall. Up among the living, down among the dead. And again, this is a perpetual kind of cycle And it's not the resurrection. But I even make this comparison between Horus and a kind of death and rebirth that you might see there, and Persephone up among the mortals down in Hades over and over and over again. I draw this comparison to make a point. Namely, and this is according to the renowned scholar of religious studies, Professor J.Z. Smith. Yes, that's his real awesome name. And according to Professor J.Z. Smith, our category, our shoebox of dying and rising gods is just that, a category, a shoebox that we have made to make things clean and quick and simple. Like, here are the stars in the sky, but we draw the lines where we want to and make constellations. And so it's a category that we ourselves have invented. And in fact, we have done so. This category of dying and rising gods is a concoction that only existed maybe in the 1800s or moving forward. And in fact, I think it largely had to do with Christians either being overly eager to point to the truth of Christianity by trying to insert it into pre-Christian myths, or skeptics and detractors of Christianity being overly eager to dismiss it or prove it wrong by trying to make the claim that these were copycats. But the honest truth is that category is late in the game, and it's just that. It's a quick and easy method, but that's not how good religious studies works. Good religious studies does not try to find an easy catch-all and say, oh, the Jews have Moses, and the Christians have Jesus, and the Muslims have Muhammad, so they're all practically the same religion. Rather than trying to force everything to have this one-to-one, apples-to-apples kind of parallel and fit everything into these quick and easy categories or shoeboxes, the much better scholar of religious studies wants to try and hear every myth, mythos, deity, god, religion, spiritual practice on its own terms, trying to hear it for itself, and not try and make quick and easy categories for our convenience. And so a fable of dying and rising gods is just that. It's contrived for our convenience. So then that's basically the Horus myth, and you'll see things which wrenched out of context and these kind of forced shoebox categories in the other deities that I'm going to mention. So the next deity that we're going to mention is the Greek god Dionysus, whom the Romans call Bacchus, okay? So let's go down the roll again. Virgin birth? Again, no. Dionysus' birth was as follows. Zeus copulated with a mortal woman, and she became pregnant. And when Zeus's goddess wife, Hera, became angry and suspicious and went looking around for the evidence, Zeus tried to cover his tracks by basically cesarean sectioning Dionysus out of the womb of this mortal woman and hiding him inside of his own thigh to try and cover up the evidence. And then finally, when Hera's suspicions were quelled and things returned to normal, he produced Dionysus back out again from his thigh. Curious story, interesting story, very visceral story. Not at all a virgin birth, though, and certainly nothing at all like the virgin birth that Christianity requires. And again, no one in their right mind who had not already been told to try very hard to read Christian themes into pagan religions would read that story and ever say, oh, that's just like the Virgin Mary and Jesus. That's ridiculous, if I can say so. Okay. So no virgin birth. What about Dionysus turning water into wine? Dionysus, Bacchus, the god of wine. We've got you right here. Bada bing, bada boom. Wedding feast at Cana. Jesus turned water into wine. Case closed. He's a copycat, right? Well, no, not at all. I want to demonstrate this in two ways. Number one, first, I think one would assume from a generic standpoint that a god of wine would have power over wine and to turn water or Coca-Cola or dry leaves or anything into wine, maybe even produce wine or vines or grapes from out of thin air. So I don't think that you can say that this is a copycat any more than, my fishing story is a copycat of my brother's fishing story, because they both involved like a boat and some water and a fish and a fishing rod. We can't make that connection just because things are kind of generically there. One would assume deities, generally speaking, perform miracles. So it's no evidence that Bill Maher or the Zeitgeist documentary would say Jesus was also known for performing miracles. Why would we have a story about a deity or a god? Why would we call this character a god or a goddess at all if they literally performed no miracles? So whether or not any of them are true or not, that's a lazy stretch to try to say Jesus is a copycat. But at any rate, the second point that I want to make to demonstrate that Jesus turning water into wine is very different from the Roman god Bacchus or the Greek Dionysus is his Roman festival called the Bacchanalia. Now we know that the wedding feast, Jesus turning water into wine was in the context of a wedding. And everyone knows that Christianity is known for practicing temperance, modesty, abstinence, self-control. Drunkenness is obviously a sin in Christianity, so much so that there are those Christian groups who don't even drink any alcohol at all, and even in their communion service use grape juice instead of, fermented wine. Meanwhile, when we examine the Roman wine festival called the Bacchanalia, this was a wild, lavish, raucous, extravagant, trance-like, ecstatic, naked, orgy, drunken stupor type of festival. And in fact, it got so out of hand. Dionysus is many hundreds of years older than Christianity. But even in the BCs, before Jesus was ever born, the wine festival, the Bacchanalia, became so raucous and wild and out of control that the Roman historian Livy records that it was even banned prior to the ADs, and that if one wanted to celebrate a Bacchanalia, you basically had to have a kind of government approval and maybe even Roman officers chaperone your event to make sure that it didn't get too crazy or out of control. And so you can compare the Bacchanalia to the Christian claim of Jesus turning water into wine and say that there is very scarcely a comparison there at all, if any, and I would go so far as to say none. Okay, what about crucifixion? Was Dionysus crucified? No. In fact, the Dionysus myth says he was torn limb from limb. And again, this is nothing like a crucifixion. Now, here's a last final curious claim for you. What about Dionysus' resurrection? There is, in fact, a text that seems to say that in the Dionysus myth, Dionysus was raised from the dead and ascended into heaven. How much like Christianity does that sound, huh? Here's the curious thing about that source. It is, number one, a Christian source. The church father Origen was actually writing to refute Celsus and trying to demonstrate to the Greek pagan philosopher Celsus that Jesus' story is in fact quite unlike all these other pagan myths. And in passing, in his writings to refute Celsus, he mentions the line, and he died and was resurrected and ascended into heaven. But again, this is a Christian source and a Christian author writing this, first of all. And second, this is in the 200s AD. Many centuries after the Dionysus myth would have had time to evolve. And it is very likely the case that Greco-Roman religion, wanting to have virtue and a savior motif and a personal God who's kind of close to you and hears your prayers and wants to bring you to a positive afterlife, this is something that may have been evolving because of the growing attractiveness of Christianity. So it's curious the fact that this Christian author is the one that people will cite to say, aha, Dionysus' myth says that he rose again and ascended into heaven. When many hundreds of years after the fact, it's probably more likely that the Dionysus cult was borrowing from Christian motifs to make their figure more heroic, virtuous, savior-like, and palpable. And thus they were borrowing from Christianity and not the other way around. So that's very self-defeating to me. Okay, so here's the Greco-Roman god Dionysus, or Bacchus, whichever you prefer. What about the Persian god Mithras? Now, as I said earlier, some people want to make the claim, there's so much going on in the myth of Mithras, and he's a Persian god from many centuries prior. And I'm going to get to why there's a problem there. But first of all, let's go through the alleged claim of his myth. Virgin birth? No, there wasn't a virgin birth. In fact, the archaeological evidence of the Mithras myth seems to suggest that he sprouted out of a rock. He was just born out of a rock. And in fact, he was born a fully grown man. So, again, if you want to say virgin birth means no sex involved, you can turn your head sideways and go, oh yeah, but just not really. No one would hear this story and go, man, I can't believe Jesus was such a copycat religion of Mithras, who was born a live adult out of this rock. That's ridiculous. Okay, what about the claim that Mithras had 12 disciples? Well, that is a claim, but I will tell you, it is a gross appropriation of the evidence that's available, because the Mithras cult had to do with the 12 signs of the zodiac. It was a mystery religion, and so there were symbols and rituals of initiation and different grades, and his myth had at least something to do with the 12 signs of the zodiac. What significance did the 12 signs of the zodiac have to the Mithras cult? Scholars are not entirely sure, and I'm going to get to that later and tell you why. But suffice it to say, 12 signs of the zodiac is the best attempt to cross-mesh and say 12 disciples, but obviously those aren't 12 disciples, so no going there. What about a Eucharist? There is a ritual meal that the Mithras cult engaged in together, and it may have even involved bread and wine. Well, as I said before, the Persian god Mithras existed in the Middle East, in Iran, maybe as a part of Zoroastrianism, and then centuries later, soldiers who had been warring over there may have brought back Mithras and essentially adapted their own form of Roman worship many centuries after the fact. And in fact, the Roman worship of Mithras was a social, historical contemporary with Christianity. They coexisted, and they both grew, and for a time there were churches to Jesus and underground Mithraea, which are the worshiping places of the cult of Mithras, and they coexisted. And the church father Justin Martyr even decries in this tone that he takes, is that very gross, that what the worshippers of Mithras were doing was actually a botched, bastardized version of the Christian Eucharist. And so with the evidence that we have from Justin Martyr, rather than saying Christianity borrowed from the ritual meal celebrated by Mithras worshippers, we can really say it's as likely, if not more likely, that the cult of Mithras was borrowing from the Christian Eucharist and communion for its ritual meal. Let alone the fact that in first century Roman religious practice, a ritual meal was a fairly common thing. And to say that Christianity was wholesale borrowing or stealing from Mithras is just misrepresentative of what many religious traditions were contemporarily doing coincidingly with one another. Okay, next. Did Mithras die and rise again? No, he did not. In his myth, he takes a bull, which is his enemy figure or villain to defeat or thing to become heroic over and dominate or whatever. He seems to take the bull underground, and this is evident in a lot of the archaeological evidence. You can see how Mithras is underground here. He slays the bull, and then he comes up from underground victorious, the bull having been defeated. So this is not a death, and it's not a resurrection. It is physically going under the ground and coming back up again. So no death and resurrection here. So all of this is to say that Christianity is definitely not trying to copycat and mimic Mithras. And in fact, even a lot of the claims that Jesus is trying to regurgitate in Mithras' story comes from either a misrepresentation or a misunderstanding of the Mithras religion, okay? Scholars who know their Mithras literature know, and there are multiple sources in the description below. You can see Dr. Henry's video on religion for breakfast, where he says, and I learned this in my own field of study, learning about Roman religions, there is no first-hand written evidence for the practices that Mithras worshippers celebrated. We do have caves, and we do have Mithraea, which are their places of worship. There are carvings on the walls, including writings, but this is all archaeological evidence. What we have absolutely zero of is a Mithraic priest or a Mithraic, layperson who worshipped him, who said, this is what I believe, and this is what we do, and this is where the myth comes from, and this is why we do what we do, and all of that. We also don't have anything like a Bible or a sacred text or anything that kind of gives us a top-down view of Mithraic beliefs, culture, practices, cosmology, blah, blah, blah. And so everything that scholars of Mithras are doing in the Roman period are trying to make their best educated guesses at the archaeological evidence that we have available. In fact, a well-renowned scholar on Mithras, Cumont, I believe his name is, basically makes the comparison of what if you were trying to parse together what Christians believed by having only the Old Testament, the Persian thing from 600 years prior, and then, cathedrals with stained glass and nothing more. No Bible, no church fathers, no theological doctrines or treatises, no lives of the saints and martyrs, just like cathedrals and stained glass and like the Old Testament stuff from literally like many hundreds of years prior. So you can see the idea that this is all very educated guesswork to try to arrive at what people think Roman worshippers of Mithras were doing. Now, I just have two more things to say before I round out this portion of the video, that Jesus is definitely not a regurgitated pagan myth. Number one, some of these myths do have some relevance to the birth of that figure and the date December 25th. Now, never mind the fact that the overwhelming majority of Christians who celebrate Christmas on December 25th know that they are doing so kind of for symbolic reasons, and that the majority of Christians today probably don't literally believe that Jesus was born on December 25th. And it has nothing to do with any claim that's in the gospel. But even aside from that, again, Dr. Henry's page on Religion for Breakfast goes into detail about how Christians did arrive at the date of December 25th that had nothing to do with a winter solstice or pagan religions, but had instead to do with the date of Passover and Christ's conception lining up with his crucifixion in some way. So go check out that video. Again, the link I'll put in my bibliography and or in the description below. Second thing that I wanted to say as we round out this section is all of these myths, unlike the Christian claim, are vague and distant, somewhere in a spaceless, timeless past, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. But the Gospels in the New Testament go out of their way to present specific people in specific places, doing specific things geographically, what was going on politically at the time, what was going on culturally, financially at the time. And again and again and again, as more scholarship has uncovered archaeology and compared it to the New Testament claims, it has like pinpoint specific historical accuracy. It goes out of its way to try to show you that they are not just trying to tell you a virtuous fairy tale, but are trying to relay historical events that took place. Okay, so Jesus was definitely not a myth, but where's the historical evidence for Jesus? Now, a lot of people say, well, yeah, here's the Bible, but I want extra biblical evidence. I want evidence outside of the Bible that says that Jesus lived and existed and performed these miracles. And there are extra biblical evidence for Jesus, and I'm going to spend plenty of time on those. But I want to address first the Bible as a historical document. A lot of people will try to say that the Bible just can't be taken as credible history because it includes miracles. But this betrays a misunderstanding of how genuine history of antiquity works. Everything we know about the Trojan War comes to us from sources that include accounts of the miraculous. Much of what we know and is learned in history in schools today from the life of Julius Caesar or Emperor Augustus includes the fantastical. Now, Christian and non-Christian alike, we might agree, well, those miracles didn't take place. But again, that doesn't disqualify us to look at the New Testament documents and read them as if they are any historical document. A lot of people might also not understand that the Bible is not just a source. When we're talking about the New Testament in the life of Jesus, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Paul writes several letters, and they all mention Jesus. In addition to that, we've got Peter, James, and Jude. So we have at least 8 authors of the New Testament. And what they did not do, maybe people don't understand this, but they didn't just sit in a dark room in some cabal and say, okay, what have you got? Let's write about Jesus. Let's make this story. Let's write this stuff. These are all totally, different, unique individuals with writing styles and insights. And these are independent historical sources, but they all corroborate that Jesus existed. They all corroborate that he was known for a miracle worker. He called himself the Son of God. His believers, he was crucified historically, and his believers took him to be resurrected from the dead. And all those sources corroborate as much. And so this is testimony, at the very least, to the fact that Jesus existed. We'll get into the miracles much later. Now, some people will also say, this is biased evidence. This is all people who believed in Christianity. So why should we trust what they say? They're all affirming Jesus. But again, how does that logically work elsewhere in history? Let me give you the example of Napoleon, okay? Let's say a couple hundred years after Napoleon lived and died, some really big French fans of Napoleon wanted to compile as much as they could about the life of Napoleon. And what they took was, 6, 7, 8, whatever, of his lieutenants and generals and admirals and officers who all said they knew Napoleon, and they all talked about the things that he said and did and wrote about, and compiled all these things that his officers said about him and put it into one volume. It's just not how you do history to say this doesn't count as evidence because these independent voices all said the same thing, and then later they were compiled all into one volume. And I hope my audience can understand that that's not how that works. If independent voices corroborate the same claims, that's mounting testimony that it's true, not that it's dismissible. But granted, this is just the 8 plus, voices that are specifically in the New Testament. But it is very curious to know that there is extra biblical evidence for Jesus. Let's start with the Roman historian Tacitus, called one of the great spy scholars of antiquity, a great Roman historian. And he says, point blank, Jesus of Nazareth was executed in Judea under the governance of Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius. The Syrian author and orator Lucian says, Jesus of Nazareth is the man that the Christians worship who was crucified in Palestine. And this is point for point what all 4 Gospels say. Or let's talk about Pliny the Younger, who corroborates that Christians worship Jesus like a god and mentions him more than one time in his writings. Or let's talk about the Greek philosopher Celsus that we've already mentioned, who studied and was a huge critic of Christians, the New Testament and the Christian claim. In some places he calls it sorcery. And Celsus in his writings tells stories that we don't even have access to, which lends itself to the idea that Jesus was known to have been a person outside of the New Testament documents. Or what about the Jewish Talmud, which is a series of rabbinic writings and traditions and sayings, I think beginning in the first century in the time of Jesus, and then developing over time. It mentions Jesus and accuses him of sorcery. There's also the well-known Jewish historian who worked for the Romans, Josephus. He talks rather plainly about Jesus, mentions that he was a wonder worker, mentions that his followers took him to be raised from the dead. Now, a lot of people who are at least a little in the up and up on this conversation about extra biblical evidence for Jesus will detract and say, look at this quote. This is so plain, it's easy, it's on the nose. This is very obviously like a forgery, and therefore it's not admissible evidence. And it is true that because it reads so on the nose, it's essentially unanimous among scholars that this was interpolated, probably by Christian scribes after the fact, who was trying to soften Josephus' view of Christianity and make it more credible to a Christian audience later on down the road. However, a lot of people do not know of a lesser-known manuscript that's an Arabic translation of Josephus, written after his original work. And you can see these two quotes side by side. You can see how the Arabic translation of Josephus says roundabout the same things. He was a preacher in Judea. He was known to be a wonder worker. He died. He was thought by his believers to have been raised from the dead. And so, although Josephus, as we know him and read him, was probably interpolated in this passage by later Christian audiences, the scholarly census tends to be, especially in light of this Arabic translation, that the basic claims, not the flattery maybe, but the basic claims of what Josephus is communicating in these passages is authentic history. Now, aside from these Jewish and pagan sources which talk about the historical reality of Jesus, we also have early church fathers. These are basically like the first Christian disciples after the apostles. And these would be people who are often martyred. People like Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, Clement of Rome, and Ireneaus of Lyon. These men either knew the apostles and walked with them and learned from them directly, or in the case of Ireneaus, learned from Polycarp and listened to Polycarp articulate the things that the apostles had told him directly about Jesus. And so if we take the biblical accounts of Jesus, and we take the Jewish accounts of Jesus outside of the Bible, we take the Greco-Roman pagan accounts of Jesus outside of the Bible, and the Christian claims of Jesus, all of this is extra biblical evidence for Christ. And it's not only evidence that he definitely did historically exist, but it also is evidence, if I can segue, that he was known for being a wonder worker. Again, the Jewish Talmud accuses him of witchcraft and sorcery. The biblical evidence corroborates this. They claim that Jesus got his power from the demons. Celsus claims that during his years in Egypt, when Jesus was little, that's when he learned the sorcery of the Egyptians. And he came back with this kind of wheeling and dealing sortilege and was so proud of himself, he began to call himself the Son of God. The Roman historian Suetonius, writing in the early 100s AD, calls Jesus maleficus, which can be translated as magician or even witch. We also hear Ireneaus of Lyon, who, listening to his teacher Polycarp conveying the things that the apostles did and said and taught about Jesus, both his teachings and his miracles, and Polycarp, who knew the apostles themselves, corroborates that the things that the apostles told him about Jesus are completely harmonious and in sync with what the Bible says about Jesus. So what are we to make of all this evidence that suggests something preternatural, something beyond merely material? We can dismiss it quickly and say that these people didn't know what fiction is, but that's not the case. Celsus' call is part of it a fairy tale. Or we can say that everyone, literally everyone living in this day and age, was so ignorant and so superstitious that they thought this was a miracle. Or we can say that the prevailing historical evidence that we have available to us, both in the Bible and outside, both from believers and from detractors, makes clear that Jesus had a reputation for being, and likely amassed the following and the discipleship that he did, because he was known for being a wonder worker. Now, where he got that power and precisely what he did is maybe a nuanced conversation to have. But the evidence is against the person who says these things are just fairy tales that were inserted after the fact. And the historical weight of evidence is definitely against those who say Jesus, wasn't even known for working miracles. No, the historical evidence says that he was. And I was shown this point of view at my secular university when my PhD professor said this. Part of what made Christianity attractive, the lives of the apostles attractive, and at least some factor in the popularity of the person of Jesus and in the quick spread of Christianity after Jesus, had to do with claims of the miraculous, and that Jesus was known for being a wonder worker. And that's history. Okay, so we have seen that Jesus is definitely not a myth, and we have gone bit for bit down those details. We have seen not only that he was a historical figure, but that he was known and had a reputation for being a wonder worker, both by believers and non-believers. And in fact, last point of detail there, in fact, of any figure from antiquity, even certain Roman emperors, certain soldiers, certain officers or statesmen, there's actually more evidence about Jesus of Nazareth than some of these other figures that we also take as given. So now I want to turn our attention to claims, not that Jesus wasn't real or that he existed, but that the New Testament documents themselves are not credible documents. First of all, I want to address quickly, again, the idea that these can't be credible documents because they mention miracles, and miracles are just ridiculous. Who can believe them? In logic, this is called a circular fallacy. It's called begging the question. Your premise presupposes your conclusion. And just pause and ponder, and hopefully you can hear the reasonableness of what I'm saying. So the Christian claim is that a miraculous thing happened. And Christians would want to articulate that and help to prove that a miraculous thing happened. But skeptics say you're not allowed to use anything that seems to suggest evidence of the miraculous, right? We are interested in trying to demonstrate to you, why it's reasonable to say a miraculous thing happened, but automatically we must dismiss anything that says a miraculous thing happened. That's not how that works. It's circular logic. It's unfair and illogical reasoning. Okay. But nextly, why people often criticize the New Testament and say it's unreliable is because they say the Gospels, for instance, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written so many decades after the fact that they weren't written by the apostles. It's just not reliable. Why do people say this? Let me give you a teeny tiny lesson on paleography, which is the study of trying to date ancient documents, oftentimes by things in the text. I'll give you two examples. The New Testament claims that Jesus was born while Augustus was the Roman emperor. Now, Caesar Augustus was in fact the Roman emperor. And this isn't written as any kind of prophecy or anything. So we can say at least that the Gospels were not written before Augustus became emperor. Does that make sense? That's pretty easy. Likewise, it says Jesus was crucified during the time when Tiberius was the Roman emperor. And this isn't presented as any kind of prophecy. So again, that could not have been written any time prior to Tiberius becoming the emperor, because he actually was the emperor. So that's at least like a 3-sentence crash course on what paleography is and how it works. And so some people would say that the Gospels should be dated much later in the 1st century, if not the 2nd century. Well, why do they say this? I have put a considerable amount of time into trying to answer this question, and I encourage you to do your own research as well. And it seems to me, as best I can understand it, there is one and only one reason why scholars want to say that the Gospels were dated late. And that is because Jesus very clearly predicts the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Now, we know as a historical fact, if Tiberius was the Roman emperor around such and such a time, Jesus would have lived and preached and been crucified around 33 AD. And we also know as a historical fact that the Jerusalem temple fell in between wars between the Jews and the Romans in 70 AD. This is a historical fact. And so, because Jesus very plainly prophesies the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, scholars say, well, there's no way he could have known that. Therefore, since he got it so obviously right, these books must have been written after 70 AD, which means if Jesus was kicking it around 30 AD, these books were written at least 40 years after his life and death, if not longer. Therefore, their memories would have been faded, and we can also do the math and assume that some of these apostles might have even been dead by then, and bada bing, bada boom, they're not reliable history. But first of all, like trying to claim the miraculous by only being allowed to negate the miraculous, it does seem to be a bit of an anti-miracle bias, which necessitates that the Gospels must have been written after 70 AD. As I understand it, and I have heard other scholars say, there is nothing specifically in the text which forces us to assert that these were definitely, certainly written after 70 AD. And in fact, there are certain details in the four Gospels, in the New Testament, that seem to affirm the fact that the Gospels were written much earlier. Let me give you some of these. First of all, some Gospels detail how Jesus says concerning the prophecies of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, pray that it would not happen in winter. But as a historical fact, it took place, late summer, early autumn, maybe August, September sometime. So it seems an incredibly redundant, entirely unnecessary thing to say that the gospel writers would say, pray that this would not happen in winter. Why is the spiritual practice of praying that this would not happen if it had already happened? Second detail is, someone in the Gospels asks Jesus about the temple tax. And Jesus preaches about how ultimately paying the temple tax is lawful. Now, why would there be a spiritual teaching about the legitimacy of paying the temple tax if the temple was already destroyed? And what spiritual insights or benefits would there be to someone writing a spiritual teaching about the lawfulness of paying the temple tax if the temple had already been destroyed? If the gospel writers are going to be so meticulous to recall that Jesus said, pray that it would not happen in winter, and be so meticulous to say, well, yeah, he talked about the temple tax, even though the temple had already been destroyed by the time they wrote it down, this only supports the idea that at the very least, they were incredibly concerned with getting even very small and irrelevant details precisely right, which makes it hard to dismiss as wrong if they were that concerned with small, precise details. Or, probably better, is the idea that they would have only said that because it was sensible to say because the temple had not been destroyed and torn down. Never mind the fact that, I'll let you do your own research on this, but I remember reading somewhere that the money used for the Jerusalem temple tax was later appropriated by the Romans to a temple of Jupiter or some other, false god and stuff like that. And so if the temple had already been torn down, it seems incredibly odd that Jews who were at a particular cultural moment of animosity towards the Romans would have condoned essentially giving money to be reappropriated to a pagan temple somewhere. We know Christians were martyred because they wouldn't even as a superficiality pinch incense in front of a statue of Caesar, whether or not they believed in it or not. They wouldn't do it even as a matter of pretense, and they were willing to be killed for it. So again, it seems odd that Jesus would be saying, yeah, sure, give your money to what will essentially be rerouted to the Temple of Jupiter. But again, I'll let you do your own research there. Third, here's another detail. Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and also the book of Acts, details in the book of Acts that some small-time prophet, who's mentioned, I think, nowhere else in the Bible, arrives on the scene and prophesies about a coming famine. And Luke is so impressed by this that he says, and this prophecy came to pass under the time of Emperor Claudius. Who was this prophet? And why is what he said particularly important? But it was a detail that impressed Luke enough, and he wanted his audience to know that the prophecy had come true at a particular place and time. So it seems all the more likely that if Jesus, who they believed to be the Messiah and to have a unique divine relationship to God the Father, that if he should claim the temple would be torn down, and then in fact it had happened, and they are writing about it after the fact that Luke mentions this nobody of a prophet and how his prophecy specifically came true, it seems incredibly likely to me that the gospel writers would want to say, oh, and this came true. This actually happened under the reign of Emperor Titus. But they didn't mention it. So again, I think this is corroborating evidence that the Gospels were written prior to the time of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. But another bit of evidence that suggests earlier writing as opposed to later writing is the book of Acts itself. You can read the intro to the Gospel of Luke, read the intro to the book of Acts. It's very obviously written by the same author. Luke is the prequel, Acts is the sequel. And Acts conveys ancient church history, ancient Christian history, and what happened to the apostles, what they did, where they preached, etc., after the time of Jesus. Now, Luke was the traveling companion of Paul, and he spends the last many chapters detailing the life of Paul. Now, Luke in the book of Acts mentions the death of James, one of the apostles, but the book of Acts ends before Paul was martyred, which we know for historical fact, before Peter was martyred, that we know for historical fact, before Paul's trial, before his imprisonment. The book of Acts also says nothing about the fall of the Jerusalem temple, which would have been a huge event in church history and affected Jew and Christian alike. It does not mention the great fire of Rome that happened during the reign of Emperor Nero. Nero blamed this on the Christians, and that was one of the first great martyrdoms and persecutions in church history, which is very likely where and when Peter and Paul would have been martyred. But Luke doesn't mention this. Luke ends the book of Acts by saying, he and Paul reached the shores of Rome. There were Christian brethren there, and he greeted him, and that's it. That's where the book of Acts literally ends. It is very much as if Luke is recording things as they develop, and when he reaches the present moment, i.e., Paul reaching Rome, that's the end of the story. What else can I detail? Because I've reached the present moment. Now, some would say, well, he wasn't trying to give a detailed description of how every martyr died and a full account of Christian history. He was more so concerned with detailing how Christianity reached Rome. But that can't quite be the case. We can't say Luke's purpose in writing Acts was to detail how Christianity reached Rome, because you can see at the end of the book of Acts that when Paul arrives on the shores of Rome, there are already Christian brethren there who gladly greet him. So then what can we say? How might we date the Gospels? If the fire of Rome, which is mentioned nowhere in the book of Acts, happens somewhere around, say, 64, 65 AD, and that's around the same time that Peter and Paul would have been executed, we might say that Luke completes the book of Acts somewhere around AD 62. Now, if he wrote the Gospel of Luke first, obviously, we can say he wrote the Gospel of Luke around AD 60. Scholars tend to agree that Mark came first and was written earlier. So then Mark might have been written around AD 50. Even prior to Mark, there are proto-gospel manuscripts and sources, such as document Q. Scholars tend to unanimously agree that, again, probably to avoid notions of the miraculous, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are in many paragraphs word for word exactly the same, that they must have drawn from a prior source. These would be sources such as document Q. So these might have been written around 40 AD. Some of Paul's letters are written very early in Christian history, and the Pauline Creed is a basic rudimentary creed that mentions Jesus' death, resurrection, and appearance afterwards. And Paul says in his writings that he received it. He wrote it a good while after he received it, and even when he received it, he indicates that this proto-creed had already been in circulation and in use among Christians prior to him. And so some scholars date this pre-Pauline creed to within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion and the alleged events of Easter Sunday. So again, with all these sources, some of them are dating to within 5 or 7 years of Jesus' crucifixion. So as ancient documents go, again, we've seen the reliability and the plausibility of this early dating theory. It may very well be the case that some of these documents and some of these sources that speak of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection could have been written somewhere between 5, 8, 10 years from the time of the historical events themselves. I hope I've demonstrated how this is a plausible theory, but to even strengthen my argument, even supposing that the Gospels were written later rather than earlier, it still would have mathematically been well within the time of the lives of the apostles, and although they would have been older, anyone who's had a conversation with their grandparents or whomever would know that with older individuals, yeah, they might struggle to tell you what they had for breakfast on Tuesday, but something that happened 30 or 40 years ago, something that was very pivotal in their lives and happened during the formative years in their lives, they can still recall these kinds of events with plenty of detail and accuracy. So I believe that there's a good case to demonstrate that they were written earlier rather than later, but even still very much within the apostles' lifetimes and their working knowledge. What else do we have to support the idea that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John themselves? The early church. I'm not going to show you every single quote, but here's a page on screen from Justin Martyr. He mentions more than one time that the Gospels are the memoirs of the apostles. Here's Tertullian, who not only says that the apostles themselves, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wrote the Gospels, but even in writing in the 200s AD, he criticizes the views and the authority of the Gnostics living in his time and says, look, you can come to our churches where the thrones, i.e. the founding of the churches by the apostles themselves, occurred in this place, and we have the autographs, the originals that the apostles wrote. They still existed even in the 200 and some odds when Tertullian would have written that. There are many more quotes I suppose I could have given, but in summation, this historian says it succinctly. All the earliest Christian writings are completely unambiguous and unanimous about who wrote the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So those who are going to contest that they were written late, and those who are going to contest that they were written by people after the fact who didn't even know the apostles, and then the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were penned on them later, people who support that theory are doing so against the consensus of history. So all this is to say that it is reasonable to assert that the Gospels were written earlier rather than later, and that the consensus of history is uniform, that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, so next, skeptics might say, all right, well, even granted that the apostles wrote them, these things are basically 2,000 years old. There's no way we can demonstrate that they haven't been doctored or altered or had fairy tales inserted into them after the fact. But actually you can. As I said, there is an abundance of quotes from the early church fathers commenting on the passages of Scripture or writing sermons and homilies for these Scripture passages, so much so that the entire New Testament can essentially be reconstructed from the amplitude of quotations from the early church fathers that we have available. If this weren't enough, we have tons and tons of manuscripts to verify between one another how they might have changed over time. And let's talk about that. People will say, Matthew, how do you know what the Gospels were originally saying? How do you know what the New Testament was actually saying? Everyone knows there are errors in the text. Everyone knows that there are variations and that these variations say different things. But I'm going to demonstrate how this is a big misunderstanding. Yes, it is true that in the academic study of manuscripts, it's called textual criticism, there are variants. They say different things. Let's look at this example on the screen. Let's say these 10 sentences here are 10 different manuscripts that are uncovered of the Gospel of Matthew, Bateman says. All right? And you can see that every single one of these manuscripts has an error in it, a mistake. And that means that every single one of them is a variant. They say different things. But it's pretty easy to demonstrate here, based on the abundance, that if the passage itself is not clear despite the error, that the abundance of manuscripts makes 100% clear what this passage of Scripture is supposed to say. Here's a video that you can visit from Matt Whitman at the 10-Minute Bible Hour. He goes into a lot more detail about this. But suffice it to say that 85% or more of errors and variations in the New Testament are things of this nature. Simple scribal errors. A word was misspelled. Have you ever been typing really fast and you skip a word? Have you ever been typing or reading really fast and you write the same word twice? Have you ever been reading in a book and instead of going down to the next line, you go back and you just read the same line twice? Maybe someone's dictating something for you and you hear, he wants to give rather than he wants to live. But again, the multiplicity of manuscripts that we have available make clear what these verses are trying to say. In the many, many hundreds of verses in the New Testament, I do not even think that there are 10 where the actual Greek is unclear to us in terms of what was actually said. And that's a big deal in terms of ancient documents. So when we hear errors in the text, we're not talking about spiritual errors or moral errors or factual errors. Again, I said earlier in the video how the geography and the archaeology that we're continuing to uncover to this day makes the Gospels increasingly more accurate in the time and place data that they're trying to assert. And the big variance might have a different number of this versus a different number of that, but it doesn't do anything to change the moral and spiritual truth of what's being conveyed here. When we say errors in the text, we do not mean some text that claims that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is 3 separate gods. When we say variations in the text, we are not talking about some version of the Gospel of Luke that says Jesus did not rise from the dead, or that he was beaten to death rather than crucified, or that he had like a secret love life with Mary Magdalene and conceived children with her. This is not in the least what New Testament scholars of whatever religious tradition or lack thereof are talking about when they mention errors or variations in the text. So here's some final food for thought on this issue. This is not my area of expertise, so I'm going to show you what I know, and I'm going to encourage you to go and do your own research. But if I'm looking at any ancient document, if it's an old copy of the Constitution, or if it's Beowulf, or if it's the writings of Aristotle, or whatever the case may be, here are some basic and pretty obvious criteria to see if your document is like sturdy, reliable, intact, and if what it says to the best of our contemporary reconstruction is what you had when it was originally written. Okay? So first, how old are our oldest surviving manuscripts in relation to the actual event? Number 2, how old is our oldest complete surviving intact copy, in this case, of the New Testament? Number 3, how many manuscripts do we have available for our comparison? And number 4, among those manuscripts that we have available, how much or how little variation do we have among them? And far and away, thanks to the dedication of ancient scribes, when it comes to the oldest copy related to the actual event, when it comes to the oldest surviving copy, how many manuscripts do you have available for comparison, and how little variation do you have among the manuscripts that you have, the New Testament wins by any and every metric of ancient document reliability and authenticity. Now, here's what that does and does not mean, okay? 2,000 years from now, if someone is able to recreate via manuscripts the same U.S. Constitution that we have today, that does not mean that what it says is like spiritually, morally, ethically, politically true, all right? It doesn't mean that democracy is better than a monarchy. It doesn't mean that freedom of speech is intrinsically good. It doesn't mean that a right to bear arms is intrinsically good. But it does mean that what we read is what was originally written. And so again, this does begin to make a mounting case for the fact that if it very well could have been written earlier, if all of our historical sources make clear that the apostles themselves did write the event, and that the many, many quotations from the early church, in addition to the gold star standards that the New Testament has among any documents of antiquity, to demonstrate that what we see now in the present day is what was originally written, and that it hasn't been doctored or fabricated or perverted from the original. This is all again mounting evidence that the reader and the person pursuing truth would want to observe and say to him or herself, maybe now I can begin to examine the truth claims and the spiritual claims and begin to weigh out in my heart and my mind with my critical thinking skills the notion of Jesus being resurrected from the dead. Okay, now next, scholars might say, all right, even granted that the New Testament is historically authentic and reliable and that it remains in the present day what it was in antiquity, this is still the church trying to sequester and control the narrative of what people were saying about Jesus. Everyone knows about the Gospel of Judas Iscariot and all the other Gnostic Gospels of all the other things that people were writing. Why should we believe these documents just because they were put into a Bible, as opposed to any of the things that people said about Jesus? Now, this is an interesting challenge, but in all truth, what makes it the most challenging in the modern day is only because most of us are not historians and we don't know quite how to examine ancient documents and weigh them out for authenticity, paleography, variability among the manuscripts that we have available to us, etc. 2,000 years after the fact, it's kind of a difficult thing if you don't know what you're doing on an academic level. But I can help you to understand how the ancients, how the first Christians did not have any serious doubts about whether or not these Gnostic Gospels, such as the Gospel of Judas Iscariot, were written by the apostles and conveyed the historical Jesus. Okay, here's an example. Think about the show Stranger Things. Popular show, set in the 80s, and they do a good job to set that atmosphere with the haircuts and the clothing styles, with the music choices they use, and even with real TV commercials that they're using to help set that tone and that flavor. Now, 1,000 years from now, if someone digs up Stranger Things, yes, it's going to take a trained eye to say, this is not from the 80s. But here in 2022, we have no problem differentiating between 1986 and 2022, even when it's meant to feel like the 80s. No one is watching the show in 2022 and saying, oh, this is from the 80s. This was filmed in the 80s. And just the same, people who study film aren't going to be confused by that either. They're going to know the difference in the history of film between what 2022 looked like when it was trying to emulate the 80s and what the 80s actually looked like. And the exact same thing can be said for the Gnostic texts, which would include the Gospel of Judas Iscariot and these other similar works. no one is going to be confused in the ancient world. There was already enough gap in time, in writing style, and in culture, in cultural nuance, and geographical nuance, to be able to say, okay, this is what was being written in the New Testament era by the apostles in the mid-first centuries or whatever, and this is what fan fictions were being written about them or like them, trying to copy that style over 100 years later, 160, 180, 210, sometimes later. And just the same, scholars of antiquity who dig these things up and know the telltales and know the hallmarks of what this time period, what that versus that time period actually looked like, are not confused either. And so, in the year 100, in the year 110, 120, 130, people are writing more and more and more about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, about Romans and Ephesians and Thessalonians and all of these, okay? But it isn't until 180, 210, 250, or later AD that anyone starts talking about anything contained in these Gnostic texts. By the time these Gnostic texts really come into prominence, it is already patently obvious that no leaders of the church regarded them as legitimate. Very few church congregations, if any, had these circulating in their congregations being read on Sunday morning. So the clergy didn't regard them as serious. The laity in the time that they were written very often did not regard them as serious. And these texts go out of their way to present themselves as authentic. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, being written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, did not sign their works by Matthew. The Gospel of Luke, according to Luke, written by Luke. But these Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene or Judas Iscariot, very often have on them the Gospel of Judas, trying very hard to present themselves as authentic. Something else to consider is, the New Testament is written in Greek because the Hellenized world after Alexander the Great spoke and wrote in Greek oftentimes. It was the lingua franca, just like English is today. But the only surviving copy that we have of the Gospel of Judas was written in Coptic. So unless Judas Iscariot spoke Coptic, this definitely lends itself additionally to the idea that these were not autographs of the apostles. Now, like I said, Matt Whitman at the 10-Minute Bible Hour has much more in detail to say about the invalidity of these texts, how the early church knew it, and how scholars of antiquity know it today. But if I can make a final point, I'm not trying to be hoity-toity or tout what I've read and what I've known, but these are the apocryphal texts. This is the Nag Hammadi library. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the New Testament Apocrypha. I have read decent portions of these texts. And I'm asking you to consider, even if you're not a Christian and you don't believe, that someone who appreciates history and someone who appreciates religious literature can read the New Testament from Matthew to Revelation and find a coherent feeling about who Jesus is, what he says, what he does. The Gnostic texts, like the Gospel of Judas, among others, Jesus laughs at his apostles and tells them what idiots they are and tells them that they're never going to be saved because no one can understand the truth. Likewise, Jesus goes on in many of these places about this rather mystical, hippy-dippy 18th wing of the angel, and he's naming all this lines and lines of these emanations that come from God. Mixanther and Mykonor, Akramos and Strempochos, Heli Makar Makar Seth, the unspeakable virgin spirit, the self-generated God, Samblo and Arbraxas and Gabriel and Elinnos and Seldau, almost on a mushroom trip of this esoteric spiritual knowledge, which is what Gnosticism was. It wasn't a religion per se, but an umbrella of beliefs that grew up in many instances alongside Christianity, but had this very quasi-Christian feel to it. This book demonstrates, the Gnostic texts say things like, The devil was the good guy because he wanted Adam and Eve to have knowledge, right? Because knowledge is good. It says that they are like two different gods, that the God of the Old Testament is an evil God who made the material world, and that the New Testament was authored by the good God who made the spiritual world. It talks about reincarnation. These books talk about how Jesus is just one of the mental emanations of the one true God, and that there were dozens of others with all these strange names, that Jesus is just one of them, that wisdom was a separate one, that beauty and truth were all these separate, spirits that just kind of emerged from the mind of God. These books say things like the Holy Spirit is a female spirit, and that God the Father and the Holy Spirit, the Mother, conceived the spiritual Jesus in heaven. I don't know if you can see this or not, maybe zoom into your video, but it has these long, esoteric, trance-like chants that are just sort of glossolalia, or this weird kind of mystic tongue that the reader is supposed to chant. So I know it might be an odd point to make for the person who doesn't believe. One bit of spiritual mumbo-jumbo might be not any better or any worse than another bit of spiritual mumbo-jumbo. But as a last point of consideration, if you were to read Matthew through Revelation, I think most people can agree that it has generally the same feel, that it doesn't say wildly contradictory things, that it doesn't go out of its way to be wildly esoteric like some kind of crazy mushroom trip. And this is, again, just one point of consideration that the ancient church definitely took to heart when they would read texts like this and go, some of us, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp of Smyrna, Clement of Rome, some of us who walked with the apostles, or Ireneaus of Lyon, and those like him, who learned from the first generation after the apostles, we've read these documents and we've considered these sorts of things, and they don't sound anything to us like the things that the apostles themselves conveyed, which is the point that Tertullian was trying to make when he says to these Gnostic groups, come to the churches where the thrones of the apostles are. In other words, the churches that Peter and Paul and Matthew and others actually founded themselves, where we have the autographs of the apostles still in our hands. And you want to talk to us about your claim to authority? You want to try and say that you're producing this new gospel that no one else ever considered before? I hope I'm making my point clear. All right, so let's begin to move on to our next overall point. People will assert, okay, Jesus was a holy man. People took him to be the Messiah. People took him for a wonder worker. But he's just a prophet or something. Jesus never claimed to be God. This is something that was invented later on. But this is not the case. The Gospel of John opens, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. It also says everything was made through him, and yet in the book of Genesis, when the creation of the world happens, what do we see except God creating the heavens and the earth? Jesus says Abraham rejoiced to see the Messiah coming. The Pharisees balk at him. You're not even 50 years old. How do you say that you've seen Abraham? Jesus says, amen, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am, identifying he himself as the burning bush that spoke to Moses in the Exodus story. Philip said to Jesus, Lord, show us the Father, and it will be enough. Jesus said, have I not been with you all along? He who has seen me has seen the Father. When Thomas finally sees the risen Jesus and is able to put his fingers in Jesus' hands and in his side, he says, my Lord and my God. It says that upon seeing the risen Christ, they fell down and worshipped him. And Jesus does not rebuke him. There are other instances of the Bible of people coming and paying homage and worshiping Jesus, and Jesus never rebukes them. John in the book of Revelation bows down to worship an angel because he's so awestruck. The angel says, stand up, I'm just a created being too, don't worship me. In the book of Acts, people are so impressed by the miracles of Peter that someone bows down to pay him homage. And what does Peter say except, I'm just a believer in a created being too. Stand up, don't worship me. But on several occasions, Jesus receives worship and never rebukes them. The wise men, the Magi, come to Mary and Joseph in the Christmas story, and they worship Jesus. Mary and Joseph never rebuke them. Jesus said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Paul calls Jesus the image of the living God. In Revelation, Jesus reveals himself as the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. But the first and the last are titles for God. Now, I've already demonstrated everything I need to about why the entirety of the New Testament is historically reliable and how what we read today is what was originally written. But some will critique and say that so much of Jesus' divinity comes from John, who is thought to have been writing later in the Apostolic period. And this may be so. Maybe he was writing later. Maybe he was younger. Of the original 12, Matthias taking Judas Iscariot's place, all of them are historically known to have been martyred except John the Apostle, so he would have had time to live longer and write more in a later period. Even still, though, I want to demonstrate the divinity of Jesus by the Gospel of Mark. It's nearly unanimous that Mark is the earliest gospel to have been written. It's the shortest and most concise about the life of Jesus. And admittedly, perhaps it is the least blatant about Jesus' divinity. But I want to demonstrate a passage from the opening text of Mark, which indicate Jesus' divinity, okay? Mark 1:1, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So right out of the gate, Mark starts with a pithy statement of how Jesus is much more than just a prophet. He has a divine relationship to God, okay? And the Son of God is in ways an allusion to the Old Testament, indicating that the Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, existed from eternity. Even moving down to the next two verses, Mark chapter 1, verse 2 and verse 3. This is the opening of Mark, and he's giving Old Testament prophecies indicating how John the Baptist would be a forerunner, a precursor to the Messiah. Chapter 1, verse 2 reads, "Behold, I send my messenger," John the Baptist, "I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you," speaking of the Messiah. And verse 3, "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths." So the voice of one crying in the wilderness is the forerunner, the precursor, John the Baptist. And who are his paths? The precursor would make his paths straight. The paths of the Messiah. Now these are two different quotations from Old Testament prophets. Mark 1 verse 2 is quoting Malachi 3:1, and Mark 1 verse 3 is quoting Isaiah 43. So these are two quotations that are prophecies of Old Testament prophets talking about the coming of the Messiah and talking about the precursor who would prepare the way for the Messiah. But we're going to go back to the Old Testament because these are references to Old Testament prophecies, but the prophecies themselves make blatantly clear who it is that we're talking about in the opening passages of Mark. Mark chapter 1, verse 2. It says, "Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you." But this is an allusion to Malachi 3:1. When we read Malachi 3:1, it says, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me." This is God talking in the first person. So the reference in the New Testament says, "Who will prepare the way before you, you the Messiah, you are going to come," says Mark. But the prophecy itself says that this forerunner, my messenger, will prepare the way before me. God talking in the first person. Mark chapter 1 verse 3 again reads, "The voice of one crying," who? The precursor, John the Baptist. "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord," this precursor says. "Make his paths straight." But this reference in Mark 1:3 is a reference to Isaiah 40 verse 3. It says, "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Make straight his paths," Mark says. Who are his paths? "Make straight a highway for our God," the prophet Isaiah says. So his paths, the paths of the Messiah, are the paths of our God. And so Mark, who is the earliest gospel and who admittedly is perhaps the least on the nose about Jesus' own divinity, still busts out of the gate with, he is the Son of God. God in the first person said, I am coming, I am the Messiah. Isaiah chapter 40 verse 3, the Messiah will be God. This is what Mark is trying to indicate in the opening passages of his gospel. So all of the gospels, all of the New Testament are clear. And if you misunderstand still, here is Ignatius of Antioch. 3 separate quotes. Who is Ignatius of Antioch? The first century bishop of the church in Antioch, where the disciples were first called Christians. This man was martyred by being fed to lions. He walked with the apostles, and he says, Jesus is God. Here's again another quotation from Justin Martyr, writing in the circa 160s AD. Martyred for his faith, a philosopher who converted to Christianity, and he wrote in his era more than any other apologist did. Ample quotations. Jesus is God. Here's Ireneaus of Lyon, who was taught by Polycarp, who knew the apostles. And what does he say except Jesus is God? Here's 2 Clement, which was at least attributed to Clement, who again was the bishop of Rome, who was said to be consecrated by Peter the Apostle himself, Pope Clement I. In 2 Clement, which was at least attributed to Clement, and what does it say except Jesus is God? Here's the Epistle of Barnabas, written circa 70 AD, who some scholars believe was written by Barnabas, who traveled with Paul. And what does he say except Jesus is God? It was Jesus to whom the Father said in the beginning, let us make man in our image, speaking in the plural. Even the Gospels say the Jews were angry with him and sought more reasons to kill him, so even the Pharisees in Jesus' time took him as claiming to be equal to God. Again, there are Roman authors I've already quoted, but what does Pliny the Younger say except they meet on a fixed day of the week and sing chants to Christ as if to a god? What does the Syrian orator Lucian say except Christians worship the man who is crucified in Palestine? So the person is in a very precarious position who is an unbeliever, yet theologically trying to assert that the idea that Jesus is God, was understood to be God, claimed to be God, or was worshipped as God, was some kind of late invention. This is ridiculously contrary to history. How could the apostles have so misunderstood what they not only wrote in the New Testament, but which they conveyed to their first disciples and successors that they died for? But someone in 2022 has more insight than they have to say, oh, they misunderstood what Jesus was trying to say. So next, after everything that has thus been said and done and covered, hopefully my viewer is now willing to consider a fundamental question in determining whether Christianity is true. What happened to the body? I know this might be a difficult thing to produce 2,000 years after the fact, but all of Christianity would crumble if Jesus had not risen from the dead. And so, if archaeologists ever did uncover some ossuary box that says, here are the bones of Jesus in Nazareth, the son of Joseph the carpenter, and Mary his mother, who was crucified under Pontius Pilate, then all of Christianity would seem to fail. Now again, this would be an odd thing to produce 2,000 years after the fact, but Christianity was very problematic to Jewish culture and stability. Christianity was very problematic to Roman culture and stability. And so one would think that the Jews or the Romans in the several decades after Jesus' death would have wanted to produce a body and say, stop this. Let's be done with this charlatan. But it didn't happen in antiquity, and it hasn't happened in any history or archaeology ever since. So I hope we're at a decent place where we can say, well, what happened to the body of Jesus? Where did the Christian notion that Jesus rose from the dead come from? We have already dismissed that it was a myth or that it was some late fabrication. All the rest of my video demonstrates that. So what are the theories then? These are the sorts of things that skeptics of Christianity up until this point will say. Okay, a big one says that the body was stolen. But let's try and think, well, who stole the body? Was it the Romans? No, the Romans would have no need to steal the body. Like I said, Christianity was troubling to their culture and stability, and they could have quelled the whole thing and centuries of persecutions after to just say, here's the body of your leader, shut up, it's time to go home. Was it the Pharisees and the Jewish religious leaders who stole his body? Again, they would have no reason to do so either. They thought Christianity was problematic, both theologically and socially, and they would have had every reason to produce the body and quell Christianity and squash it, nip it in the bud, just the same as the Romans would. What about the Christians? If the Christians thought he was going to rise from the dead and were glad he was the Messiah, perhaps they would have stolen the body and made up the myth. But there are a few reasons why this doesn't make sense. Judas Iscariot killed himself, but Matthias, his replacement, and all the other 11 apostles died gruesome deaths, beaten to death with clubs, beheaded, crucified. One of them was filleted and had his skin removed. Even Paul, who joined the apostles later, spent his time killing Christians. Why would he be willing to go to his death for what he knew to be a lie? Now, please don't misunderstand me here. There are a lot of people who might die for something that is not true. As a Christian, of course, I believe that Muslim freedom fighters and stuff who die for their faith are doing so falsely, but they believe it to be true. Imagine someone knowing with 100% certainty that Jesus rising from the dead was a lie, and then being willing to die a gruesome, bloody death, and not one of them let slip the ruse that they had the body of Jesus, they buried him elsewhere, and they're making up this lie about him. Similarly, within 100 years before or after Jesus, there were several other so-called Jewish messiahs because the Romans were their oppressors and they wanted to oust the Romans and kind of re-proclaim the kingdom of Israel. But what happened to these messiahs? They were executed and their followings just fizzled out and went home. None of them had any notion of creating a lie of a savior figure. Why would the apostles? For religious and political control? I can't see that as a tenable theory. These were very run-of-the-mill, blue-collar Israelites, fishermen and farmers and so forth. And so grandiose plans of political control are really inconceivable. Christianity didn't become anything even remotely like any kind of a political force until well into the 300s AD, 300 or more years after all the apostles were already martyred and dead. And even then, it didn't become a political apparatus to affect change and assert control in the way that people would think until practically into the Middle Ages, 900 AD, 1000 or more AD. So it's ridiculous to me to think that the apostles thought this would work, and it would work by them gruesomely dying for something that they knew to be a lie. So what about a hallucination? We know that hallucinations can happen, especially in times of grief. So it's plausible that the apostles were very grieved that their dear friend had died. My dad died not very long ago, and I didn't have hallucinations, but I did have very lucid dreams that made me feel like he was very near to me, and his memory was very imminent in my life, though I didn't hallucinate. So I can definitely sympathize with the idea that the apostles hallucinated. And I don't know the psychology to say, but apparently mass hallucination is sometimes a thing. But mass hallucination, at least as I understand it, is something big happened and we all felt warm and weird about it, and wasn't that crazy, right? But mass hallucination is not, who is that? Who do you mean? That guy calling out on the shore. Oh, that one there? Cooking fish on a fire? Yeah, that's the one. Let's jump out of the boats, swim over to him, and have a breakfast of fish and bread with him while we sit and eat and talk with him. Jesus ate food with them on more than one occasion, and Jesus even ate to demonstrate to them that he was not a ghost or an apparition. He said, a spirit does not have flesh and bones like you see that I have. A mass hallucination is not, hey, you two on the road to Emmaus, let me elucidate to you in a 30, 45-minute, hour-long conversation or more all of the things in the Old Testament that are referring to me. A mass hallucination is not, hey, Thomas, I know you've been doubting as to whether or not I rose from the dead or not, but here, come and stick your fingers in the holes of my hands. Come and stick your fingers in the hole in my side. This is eating and drinking, talking and laughing, bodily touching. This is visceral stuff. This isn't like vague, warm, wispy, we imagined something. And it wouldn't be in the imagination of first century Jews that one person would have been risen from the dead. Martha indicates in the Gospels the typical Jewish first century view of the resurrection, that this was one event at the end of time that would happen to all the righteous and the unrighteous. Not that one man would be resurrected by God to demonstrate his miraculous truths and that he was the Son of God. If they were going to hallucinating some kind of miraculous transformation or apparition into the heavenly, something like Enoch or Elijah, would have been much more realistic for first century Jews to have hallucinated if it was a mass hallucination. And this says nothing of Paul, who again spent his time persecuting and murdering Christians, yet he was so convinced, when he had no stake in the Christian claim, that Jesus had in fact risen from the dead. How was he also hallucinating? This claim just doesn't make a lot of sense. And granting for the purpose of argument that it was a mass hallucination, all of the apostles and Paul having some wild mass hallucination does not cause the body to disappear. Even if they are hallucinating, we have to ask what happened to the body. And a bunch of crazy lunatics hallucinating that Jesus had been risen from the dead could again have been quelled and squashed either by the Romans and or the Jewish religious leaders by producing the body and saying, "Nope, don't know what you guys are talking about. It's a dead body. Let's wrap this up, please." So what about claims that they went back to the wrong tomb and found it empty? Or that Jesus' body was just moved to some other tomb or to some other location? There are reasons why this doesn't make sense in general. It couldn't have been moved to another location in the Jewish rite because this was only done a year after the original burial, when everything would have had time to decompose down to the bones. Then the bones would be relocated and finally interred in a clean new place. And I have serious doubts that the Romans just took the buried Jesus, corroborated again and again by the written historical evidence that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was a rich man, would likely not have wanted his tomb to be bothered with, and also was a Pharisee and would not have wanted it to be public knowledge that he wanted Jesus of Nazareth, the criminal and rebel rouser, buried in his tomb. So the idea that the Romans just took his body and dumped him in some dump for criminals where wolves and crows came and ate him doesn't make a lot of sense, not only for that reason, but again, Rome had vested interest, as did the Jewish religious leaders, in holding on to his body because Christianity was causing problems culturally, politically, socially, religiously. So this does not seem like the most likely theory to me. And even granting, trying to build the strength of my critics' argument that Mary Magdalene, and all the others went to the wrong tomb, again, this does nothing to make the body of Jesus disappear. Both the Jews and the Romans had the ability to produce the dead body and quell this myth. So what about the swoon theory? Some people would say that Jesus didn't die on the cross. He only very nearly died, fell unconscious, and then on the third day just woke back up again and revealed himself to his apostles. This fails for several reasons as well. When he was beaten within an inch of his life, had to carry that cross over a mile from the Praetorium in Jerusalem to Calvary Hill, hung on that cross, bleeding out and slowly asphyxiating for 3 hours after all of that had already happened. And then a Roman centurion, who is a professional killer, whose job it was to make sure that he was in fact dead, stabs him in the side. For him to sit in a tomb for 3 days after that, with no food, no water, and limited oxygen inside the tomb, then to wake up afterwards is inconceivable. It is biologically, medically ridiculous. And to strengthen the argument of my critic, even supposing all that happened, and he just continued to bleed and remain semi-conscious for 3 days, if he should wake up and barely stumble out of the grave, how's he going to get the tomb door open? Even if he managed to do this. The fact that he would zombie stumble into town is not something that his apostles would see and be impressed with and see as heroic and miraculous. No myth that Jesus rose from the dead and had the keys to life and death in his hands and was the vindicated incarnate God could come from such an event. And again, even if this was the case, what happened to Jesus afterwards? He was only in his 30s. Where did he go for the next 40 or so years of his life that the apostles never said anything about him and took him to be ascended into heaven? I don't know. Never mind the fact that, again, the Jewish religious leaders and the Roman officials both had vested interest in this guy being dead. If he zombie stumbled out of the grave, why did they not seek to kill him again? How hard would it have been? He was always having to get away and travel from town to town as the Jews and Romans became more upset with him. Why is there nothing of a second crucifixion? A second execution? So the swoon theory is ridiculous as well. So what can we say? It does not seem most likely that his body was stolen. It does not seem most likely that his body was relocated or forgotten about. It does not seem most likely that his apostles all hallucinated. It does not seem most likely that he failed to actually die. Again, all of his apostles except for John, who they tried to boil in oil but it didn't work, so they exiled him to Patmos where he lived to an old age. All the other apostles died gruesome deaths for what they believe happened. And so with what at least 8 biblical authors corroborate about Jesus' death and resurrection, let alone the multitude of Jewish extra-biblical sources, Christian extra-biblical sources, and pagan extra-biblical sources that all mention Jesus and his reputation for being a wonder worker and how his apostles went to their deaths and believed that he was the Son of God and had risen from the dead, we can be solidly certain of these historical facts. That he died, that he was buried, that no body was produced, that we have any evidence of, that his apostles firmly, soundly believed that a miraculous event had occurred, namely his resurrection and his appearances to them, and these farmers and fishermen who were afraid of the Jews and Romans immediately following Jesus' death because they thought the same fate would follow them, were somehow very soon after filled with zeal about this miraculous event that they believed took place, and like wildfire, against political power and influence, and by peace and without the sword and the threat of violence. Tertullian said, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. In other words, not only did they not win battles to spread their faith, they lost battles, as it were, but their faith spread all the same. And this zeal for the miracle that they soundly understood and believed to have taken place allowed Christianity to spread quickly, nearly overnight, and without any threat of violence, at the cost of the apostles' own lives for what they themselves believed took place. By the time the New Testament is finished being written, Christianity has spread as far west as France and Spain. Some people might even claim the British Isles. As far east as perhaps India, maybe even the western borders of China. All throughout the Middle East, Turkey, Syria, Arabia, Palestine, Egypt, and into much of Africa beyond Egypt as well. Algeria, Tunisia. This type of spread with no violence within no more than 60 to 70 years after Jesus died is nigh unto miraculous in and of itself. And so I'm hoping that this demonstrates the historical plausibility that a certain first century Jewish rabbi, namely Jesus of Nazareth, rose from the dead. So what does it mean that Jesus rose from the dead? What does it mean that Jesus died for our sins? What does it mean if he is the incarnate Son of God? What does it mean if he is the solution in the supposed conundrum between God's mercy and his justice? And like I said in the last video, what does it mean that there is a point to suffering? This is something that we're going to handle in detail in our last and final video coming up next in the series, because I've already made you a feature-length film today. Suffice it to say that if there ever has been an actual resurrection from the dead, this is something categorically more than Elijah raising the widow's child from the dead. This is something categorically more than the bones of Elisha raising someone from the dead. This is something categorically more than the people that Jesus raised from the dead, the people that the apostles raised from the dead. Jesus said, "No one takes my life from me. I have power to lay down my life, and I have power to take it back up again." But this is curious if the Bible also says that God raised Jesus from the dead, and elsewhere says that the Holy Spirit raised Jesus from the dead. By saying, "I have power to lay down my life, and I have power to take it back up again," Jesus is uniting himself to the person of God. That Jesus would say the odd, strange, striking, controversial things that he said about himself, and then to be raised from the dead, means that his message and every single thing he claimed about himself is entirely true. That God would raise this person from the dead, that God would vindicate the radical claims of this man's divine authority and divine relationship to the God of the universe, is something that we cannot gloss over as bookstore chicken soup for the soul type wisdom. What you cannot make of Jesus after he is no longer a myth, after he is no longer a legend, after there is reason to believe that the New Testament should be read as the New Testament authors intended to write it, and it has not changed since then, that Jesus was either exactly who he claimed to be, or he was a bad man. What we cannot make of Jesus is just another tame bookstore spiritual guru, just another kind man with kind words for an unkind world. No. The things he said about himself are too odd, too strange, too unfathomable to make of him just another spiritual teacher. If he is not the world's most pernicious liar, if he is not the world's craziest, most radical lunatic, then he is exactly who he claimed to be. He is either Lord or liar or lunatic. And as he is not a legend or legendary or lost in translation, there seems to be no other option for the person of Jesus. And the profound reality of the incarnate Son of God dying and rising again from the dead to forgive the sins of the world is the topic that we are going to get into and finalize in my next and last video in this series. I'm Matthew Bateman. This is the New Old Catholic Family. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless.